In 2023, South Korea recorded a total fertility rate of 0.72. That is the lowest number ever measured for any country in modern history. And most people heard that statistic, nodded, and moved on. That was a mistake, because that number is 0.72 is not a South Korea story. It is not a demography story. It is not even primarily a story about babies. It is a story about your retirement, your career, your savings, the housing market, the job market, the economy you will be navigating for the next 30 years, and the people who understand what that number actually means, how it connects to interest rates, to AI investment, to geopolitical power, to where the real economic growth will happen in the next 2 decades. Those people will be making very different decisions than the people who did not pay attention. So let's pay attention. A country needs a total fertility rate of 2.1 to keep its population stable. 2 parents, roughly 2 children, with a small buffer for childhood mortality. That is the replacement level. Most wealthy countries have been below it for decades. France, Germany, Italy, Japan. All below 2.4, one for a long time. That is already notable. But 0.72 is something different. At 0.72, you are not slightly below replacement. You are producing, over time, roughly 1 child for every 3 adults. Each generation is dramatically smaller than the one before it. The curve does not flatten, it accelerates downward, because a smaller generation of parents produces an even smaller generation of children. And South Korea is not alone. China's population began declining in 2022, the first time in 60 years. Japan's workforce has been shrinking since the early 2000s. Italy, Spain, Poland, Germany, South Korea, Japan, China. Every one of these countries is facing a version of the same structural reality. Now, why does this matter to you, specifically? Here is the first financial consequence that almost nobody talks about. Pension systems were not designed for this. The pension model, whether public or private, works on a generational assumption. The current working population pays into a fund. That fund supports the current retired population. It works when there are enough workers per retiree. The ratio that most pension systems were originally designed around was roughly 5 workers per retiree. Japan is already at approximately 2 workers per retiree, and falling. South Korea is projected to reach a similar ratio before 2040. What happens when the math breaks? The system has 3 options. Raise contributions, meaning higher taxes or higher pension deductions from working people's salaries. Cut benefits, meaning the retirement income people planned for does not arrive as expected. Or raise the retirement age, meaning people work longer before accessing the money they contributed. Most countries in demographic decline are doing all 3 simultaneously. If you are building a financial plan that assumes a stable public pension at the age your parents retired on the same terms, you are building on an assumption that the demographic data does not support. This is not alarmist. It is arithmetic. The motivational implication of this is straightforward. The people who understand this early build alternative retirement structures, private savings, investment accounts, asset allocation that does not depend on a pension system operating as designed in 1970. The people who understand this late spend their final working years adjusting to a reality they did not see coming. Information that is inconvenient now is almost always more useful now than later. Here is the second financial consequence: real estate. In countries with shrinking and aging populations, housing markets do not behave the way growing population housing markets do. In a growing population, demand for housing tends to remain robust. More people need places to live. In a shrinking population, and particularly in rural and secondary cities that younger people leave in search of work, housing values can fall significantly. Not everywhere, but in specific, predictable places. Japan has entire towns with hundreds of empty houses, known as ikaya. The government has, in some cases, offered these properties for free or near free to attract buyers. The problem is not supply. The problem is the absence of demand. This is already beginning in parts of South Korea, in parts of Eastern Europe, in rural regions of Germany and Italy. The financial implication cuts in 2 directions. For people holding real estate in regions that will face demographic decline, which in many cases means rural areas and secondary cities and aging countries. Understanding this trajectory is important. The assumption that real estate always appreciates over long enough time periods is population dependent. Without population growth, that assumption weakens. For people looking at where real estate demand will be robust over the next 30 years, the answer is largely where the young populations are. India, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the countries with high median youth populations and growing urban middle classes. The geographic center of global housing demand is not where it was 50 years ago, and it is not where most Western investors are currently looking. Here's the third financial consequence: jobs and careers. Demographic decline does not just create problems, it creates shortages, and shortages create opportunity. In every aging economy, the labor market in certain sectors is already structurally tight, and getting tighter. Healthcare is the most obvious. The number of people over 65 who need medical care, home support, rehabilitation services, and long-term care management is growing in Japan, South Korea, Germany, and Italy. The number of young people available to provide those services is shrinking. That gap is a career gap. It is a business gap. It is an investment gap. The same logic applies to elder care services, geriatric technology, home automation for aging populations, physical therapy, occupational therapy, dementia care, and the entire ecosystem of products and services that a rapidly aging wealthy population requires. Peter Zahan, whose work sits at the intersection of demographics and economic forecasting, has argued that the labor shortages in aging economies will create wage pressure that actually benefits workers, particularly skilled workers, in sectors that cannot be automated. Because automation can replace many functions, but human connection, physical care, and professional judgment in complex individual situations are among the hardest things to automate well. The people who position themselves in these shortage zones, whether as workers, entrepreneurs, or investors, are running toward a problem that the demographic data tells you will get more acute, not less, over the coming decades. Now, the technology piece. This is where the demographic story and the AI story merge in a way that most people have not fully connected. AI and robotics investment is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening, in significant part, as a direct economic response to labor scarcity. Japan's robotics investment, the highest per capita in the world, did not come from ideology. It came from necessity. South Korea's 2026 economic strategy explicitly names AI adoption as a demographic solution. Germany's industrial AI policy is, at its core, a hedge against a manufacturing workforce that is shrinking as its baby boom generation retires. The countries most aggressively deploying AI are, almost without exception, the countries with the most acute demographic pressure. This means that if you are trying to understand why AI investment is growing so rapidly and where it will continue to grow, demographics is one of the most underappreciated explanatory variables. The demand is not just about technological capability. It is about filling a gap that population arithmetic is creating, whether anyone is ready or not. For investors watching AI, robotics, eldercare technology, and automation, the demographic data is not just interesting context. It is a directional signal about sustained demand that is structural rather than cyclical. It does not depend on a single product cycle. It depends on how old the population is, and the population is only getting older. Here is the geopolitical layer, because this is where the long-term financial picture gets most interesting. India surpassed China as the world's most populous nation in 2023. India's median age is 2028. Japan's is 49. South Korea's is 45. China's is 39. The demographic center of gravity of the global economy is shifting, not quickly in any single year, but permanently. And permanently matters more than quickly when you are making 30-year decisions. The countries that dominated the 20th century economically were largely countries with young, growing workforces. The countries that will dominate the 21st century economically are likely to be countries with the same advantage. And that advantage right now belongs to South and Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, not to the countries that held it before. For investors, this is the background variable behind the argument for diversification beyond traditional Western markets. For people building careers, it is the context behind the growing demand for professionals who understand these markets, their languages, their legal systems, their business cultures. The opportunity does not live where it always lived. It is moving, and demographics is one of the clearest maps of where it is going. Now, the motivational piece, because this is where most conversations about demographic decline stop at the problem and miss the most important part. Every major economic transition in history has been primarily a story of dislocation for people who did not see it coming, and primarily a story of opportunity for people who did. The Industrial Revolution displaced agricultural workers. It created industrial entrepreneurs. The post-World War II baby boom created the consumer economy, the suburban housing market, and the pension system. The demographic dividend of emerging markets in the 1990s and 2000s created the economic growth that pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and created the largest expansion of the global middle class in history. Each of these transitions was, at the time, described in terms of its disruptions, and each of them created, in the process, extraordinary opportunities for people who understood what was happening and positioned accordingly. The demographic transition we're in right now is the same kind of structural shift. The disruptions are real. The pension system pressure is real. The real estate risk in certain regions is real. The labor market changes are real, but so are the opportunities. Elder care services in aging economies. Healthcare technology. AI-enabled productivity tools in countries facing labor shortages. Real estate in high-growth population regions. Careers in fields where human judgment cannot be automated. Investment in markets where young, growing middle classes are creating sustained demand for goods and services they could not previously afford. The people who look at 0.72 and see only a problem are leaving half the analysis on the table. The people who look at 0.72 and ask what it implies for healthcare, for real estate, for technology investment, for career positioning, for geographic diversification, are doing the kind of thinking that tends to produce better long-term outcomes, because the number is not going away. It is not a crisis that will be solved by next quarter. It is a demographic reality that will shape the economy for the next 30 years. And 30 years is exactly how long you have to make decisions that will determine how you live in the part of your life that comes after. The question is not whether this transition will happen. It is already happening. The question is whether you are positioning for the world it is creating, or waiting for a world that is no longer coming back. 0.72. Not just a number. A map. And maps are useful if you know how to read them.